So this morning, Hulk Hogan, real name Terry Bollea, passed away at age 71 due to cardiac arrest. You know, I knew this day would come like my whole life. And now that it's here, it's almost surreal. Look, I want to give you my memories of Hulk Hogan because I didn't know the guy on a personal level. We weren't friends. And obviously, I'm very aware of all of the bad things that he did in the real world, including all the lies and the racial slurs and the things that the very selfish things that he did. I'm not going to in any way try to erase that this was a flawed man, but what he did for pro wrestling and specifically my life is really difficult to ignore because the reality is that I made a lot of friends because of Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan existing, being the star that he was, is the reason why I became friends with a lot of people who got into the wrestling business because of Hulk Hogan. In the mid 80s, when the WWF went national, Vince McMahon had an idea, and the guy who would be the trigger man for his idea would be Hulk Hogan. Some say it could have worked with Dusty Rhodes or Kerry Von Erich, but we have no evidence to show that that really would have worked on a national stage. But with Hulk Hogan, we do. Hulk Hogan is the reason as to why the WWE, formerly WWF, ever got to be as big as it was. He's the reason as to why wrestling crossed over to where they were focusing more on getting a younger audience like kids. And it became much more of a live action cartoon. Because Hulk Hogan was larger than life, not just in size, but in the things that he did, said outlandish things, said some insane stuff in his promos. He definitely, from what I understand, was very good to his fans and very good to the public. He never rejected an autograph, and that's something that should be commended because that's the good side of Terry Bollea. And while there's a lot of bad things that he did and said, there are a lot of people in the world who love Hulk Hogan. And I mean love the man. Like, he has a friend circle. He has people that care about him. And it's kind of interesting that a guy who was getting bigger cheers in the 80s than almost anybody else, his last appearance on Raw was at the Netflix Raw, the first one at the beginning of the year, and he got booed out of the building. People didn't want to see Hulk Hogan anymore. In reality, the likelihood of us ever seeing him wrestle again was already out the window. Surgeries after surgeries, procedures after procedures. You know, his last match that I remember seeing was him against Sting in TNA. And that was not a good match. Hogan couldn't bump. And so they had to work this really awkward match where nobody went down with the force to make it look real. It was just a bad match. And it's just crazy because, you know, I made a video about how I felt like Goldberg was ungrateful for the retirement he got. Hulk Hogan never even got that retirement. And Hulk Hogan made Bill Goldberg into a main eventer. Hulk Hogan was the guy that made WCW a platform for a guy like Goldberg to get signed. And we never saw this big final match from Hogan where his family was there. We didn't get that. The closest we got was his Hall of Fame speech. The thing about Hulk Hogan that connects me to him is that he was the first wrestler whose name I had ever heard of as a kid. My mom knew him. And my mom knew him because my mom was a very devout Catholic. And Hulk Hogan came to the ring with a necklace that had a cross on it. And he also would kiss it and, you know, do the cross with his hands on his face. And my mom thought that was amazing. That there's actually a wrestler who is a Catholic or a Christian and who did that in the ring unapologetically. You know, nobody else was doing that. Like, especially in the WWF. I know that a lot of the down south wrestling territories, you had your good guys that would bring up God and Christianity and all that. But Hulk Hogan did it on a national stage, and my mom was really into that. She was into the Mega Powers. And even though Hogan was not the first wrestler I ever watched, nor was he my absolute favorite as a kid, I actually can tell you that he's one of the first, he's got to be one of the first like five, maybe one of the first four that I'd ever seen, because everybody knew who Hulk Hogan was. Like, when people talk about wrestling or WWF in the 80s and 90s, even if they were not watching wrestling, wrestling is, oh, that's the thing that Hulk Hogan does. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't like, well, wrestling existed and here comes Hulk Hogan. Wrestling did exist and here came Hulk Hogan, but people who didn't watch wrestling just knew that that guy's a pro wrestler on a national scale. You know, every town had their favorites, but Hulk Hogan went beyond just wrestling. You know, he was in magazines, fitness magazines. He was in movies, albeit not great ones. He was kind of like, I would put him up there as like the wrestling version of Mike Tyson back then in the 80s. You know, maybe the wrestling version of Michael Jordan in the 90s, in the sense that the whole company built around him. And then in WCW, in the WCW days, when the NWO happened, it couldn't have been anybody else. I watched Bash at the Beach 96 live. I witnessed it as a 12-year-old kid. The birth of the New World Order, something that I had no idea was going to become what it became. And out of that trio of guys, Kevin Nash is the last one left. I don't know if anything could really encapsulate what Hulk Hogan did for wrestling. I mean, the guy had a cartoon. He had obviously tons of merchandise. WWF was putting out tons of merch. Every WWF video game had him on the cover, ripping his shirt, like for years and years and years. You know, just him tearing his shirt was iconic. Nobody had done that before like that. There have been other guys who did it, but not like Hogan, who made it part of his entrance. And some will tell you that Hogan was a bad wrestler. Hulk Hogan was not a wrestler on the level of a Bret Hart or a Shawn Michaels or a Will Ospreay. That wasn't his style. He was a guy who knew what he could do best and was very limited in what he did. But if you watch some of his Japan stuff, especially in the 80s, he was doing a lot more. Hulk Hogan was doing suplexes and, you know, it's a totally different style. He was bumping a lot more. But Hogan in WWF had this formula, and he did it because it always worked. The finger point, the big boot, the body slam, if applicable, and the leg drop. I have a lot of memories about Hulk Hogan being a young kid getting into wrestling. You know, Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, the Ultimate Challenge. Biggest thing to happen to me as a kid. I was alive when WrestleMania 3 happened, but I was a baby. I wasn't watching. The Mega Powers explode. Big angle. Hogan against Sergeant Slaughter in the WrestleMania 7 angle that was playing off of the real-life Persian Gulf War. As a 7-year-old kid, I had no idea that people would be like offended at wrestling, you know, using a real-life war to sell tickets. that didn't cross my mind, man. I was 7. I didn't know anything about politics. I knew George Bush was the president. That's it. Kids back then didn't care about that kind of stuff. You know? Then you have his eventual return to the WWF, where he had that match with The Rock. And the people remembered. The people remembered what Hogan meant to them. And that was the time period where he would come out and listen to the crowd. And he would cry. Like, he would get very emotional. It's almost like he had his whole career behind him. And he could have retired right there. He didn't, but he could have. And the people still wanted to see him, and they still remembered what he had done for them. Because, yeah, you've got the Bubba the Love Sponge crap. You've got the racial tape. That all came out after. That was later. Back then, in those days, the only inkling we had that Hogan wasn't a sweet guy in real life was what a lot of the newsletters said about him. But if you were a kid back then, Hulk Hogan would never say no to a kid. And that's admirable. It really is. I'm not here to defend Hogan or to praise him, but Hulk Hogan's meant a lot to me. In the past few years, I've gone back and watched every Saturday Night Main Event episode back one more time, and he's right in the middle of almost all of them. You know, he was the 80s. He was the 80s. And you could say The Rock is probably the most famous wrestler now because of his movie career. But Hulk Hogan was the most famous wrestler because even though he did this thing called professional wrestling, he was everywhere. And even if you didn't watch wrestling, you saw the cartoon, you saw the toys, you saw the posters. I mean, it's no different than, like, not on the same scale, but it's like Michael Jackson. Like, even if you weren't a fan of pop music, let's say you were into country or just didn't like 80s music, everybody on earth knew who Michael Jackson was. With Hogan, it was almost there. Not quite the same, but for wrestling, he certainly was that. I never got to meet him, and it's too bad because his restaurant is about an hour and a half away from my house. And I was going to go down there and do some karaoke and meet him and Jimmy Hart, which would have been cool. Maybe got him to sign one of my DVDs or something, you know, and just kind of told him, like, thank you for all the memories. He's not a perfect person. He had to deal with his issues, but the man has so many memories with me. It's painful. Like, it really does hurt. And a lot of people nowadays hated the guy. And I understand why. Listen, I get it. I am not even saying that trying to in any way condone what he did. It's just that most of my life there was this Hulk Hogan, and then we have, of course, the like there was a Hulk Hogan during the majority of my life from being 5 years old to being a grown adult, and then we have the modern Hulk Hogan who, you know, gets a lot of heat for lies and picking certain political candidates and things like that, who a lot of people don't like. But when I found out he died, all that happened was a flood of memories popped in my head of that Hulk Hogan, the one that I grew up with. I didn't think about, like, obviously I thought about the bad stuff he had done after, but it was like I replayed my early wrestling fandom, collecting the tapes, you know, trading tapes, watching the formation of the NWO, watching the Monday Night War, watching his return, his Shawn Michaels and Randy Orton feuds that he had in 05 and 06. You know, even his TNA run, which was, man, all kinds of problems. But you cannot deny the impact that Hulk Hogan had on wrestling. Anybody who denies it is a fool. He was a flawed man. And From what I understand, he went to my friend's sister's church. He went to that church, and from what I understand, he would repent for his sins. Now, I don't know that for certain. I wasn't there, but that's what I was told. And maybe he did. And if he did, we all make mistakes in life, but being able to say I'm sorry and I won't do it again and I acknowledge that I hurt you is important. But we're also talking about Hulk Hogan, who also was notorious lying. I mean, this guy may have been a pathological liar. I don't know. But yeah, what more can I say? But rest in peace, Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan.